This is the abridged version of Lesson 2, Journey of the Soul. We will be discussing primarily 4 different things. We have 4 different sections. Section 1 will discuss the spiritual significance of the moment of a person's passing. Section 2 will talk about the process of a soul's departure from the body. Sections 3 and 4 will examine how we care for the body of the deceased and the Jewish tradition surrounding it and its interment. Section 5 will discuss the idea of grave visitation and its meaning. Now, before we get started, in order to understand what we will discuss in this lesson, we have to understand the difference between the 2 lowest levels of the soul. The soul is comprised of 5 different stages of consciousness and kind of spiritual levels of the soul. And the lowest 2 are what are concerning today's class, are what we need to understand. And they are called Nefesh and Ruach. Now, Nefesh is what enables all physical and biological life. It drives all of our biological and bodily function. And Ruach is the part of the soul that drives our emotion and feeling. Once a person passes away, the part of the soul that served a biological function, the Nefesh, now remains with the body in the grave. The Ruach, however, the person's emotions and feelings, goes on to the Garden of Eden, to Gan Eden. So again, the Nefesh drives and powers all bodily physical function, and that remains with the body in the grave. And the Ruach drives and powers all of our emotion and feeling, and that ascends to the Garden of Eden, to Gan Eden. We will now read an excerpt from a letter which was penned by the Alter Rebbe, a great scholar and a mystic, in 1788. This was a letter he was sending to the followers, to the Hasidim, of the recently deceased Hasidic master, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Haradak. And we will discuss some beautiful things in this letter where the Alter Rebbe tries to console these Hasidim, these followers of Rabbi Mendel of Haradak. All right, so this letter will be on page 43 in the student book, text 1a. I will go through an overview of what this text is saying. Now, a tzaddik, a righteous person, their life is not necessarily, it's defined mainly by its spirituality. It's a spiritually driven life. And it's mainly, you can whittle it down to the attributes of faith, reverence, and love for God. Now, while he is alive, the only contact that we can have with the tzaddik's essence, the faith, reverence, and love for God, we can only connect to the expression of it that has to make its way through the nefesh. Meaning it's constrained within its container and garb, which is the physical body, and the nefesh, the part of the soul that drives it. And it imposes restraints of physical space on these attributes. So meaning the tzaddik's disciples are receiving just a glow of these ruach attributes, only a small ray, through the tzaddik's holy words and thoughts. So it's kind of like a handicap. So therefore, it says, actually interesting, in the Talmud that it takes 40 years for students to fully understand the depths of their master's teachings because they're only getting a ray of the true essence of their teacher and master, the ray that is allowed through the nefesh. However, after the tzaddik passes, the nefesh separates from the ruach, and the nefesh remains in the grave, while the ruach, the part of the soul that drives all the emotion and the faith, the reverence, and the love, and the spirituality, is in Gan Eden, in the Garden of Eden, and meaning anyone who is close to the tzaddik can receive directly from his ruach in Gan Eden, because the ruach is no longer constrained in a container or confined by physical space. So there is now a straightforward, simple path for the tzaddik's disciples to connect straight with his essence, and not having to take, just the whatever the rays that make it through and escape beyond their container. And you can connect to his true essence. And interestingly, he ends the letter, the Alter Rebbe, saying that the disciples connect and receive commensurate to the degree of the loving connection and closeness to the tzaddik during his lifetime and after his death. For the transmission of all things spiritual is always by means of great love. So we see that during his life, the ruach, which is what drives all the emotion and the essence of his spirituality, is confined and can only be expressed via the nefesh and its tools. But however, when the tzaddik passes away, the nefesh and the ruach separate, and the ruach is no longer limited to a specific space. It's now completely unleashed. And we say it's in the Garden of Eden, in Gan Eden, but Gan Eden is a spiritual thing. It's not a specific space. It's here, there, and everywhere, and it can be accessed everywhere as well. And not only does the separation of the nefesh and ruach help the students, but it also helps the soul itself. And we see that in the following text 1b on page 45, which I won't read word for word, but you can read it in your student book on page 45, which is saying that it also benefits the soul itself, because the soul itself, during its physical life, was kind of handicapped in certain respects by the requirements of the body. And even a tzaddik, a holy individual whose entire life is, godly, can't escape the restraints of life, the material and physical environment. He's got to eat, he's got to drink, and, so on and so forth. So when it comes time for the soul to return home, quote unquote, it's essentially like a release for it as it makes its way to a higher world, no longer restrained by the physical body, the physical environment, and the soul is free to enjoy the spiritual bliss of being near to God in its fullest measure. We'll now watch a short meditation which will illustrate what we've just been discussing and what we will discuss further.
How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear? That's what psychologists call inattentional blindness. And no, it is not a condition to be concerned about. In fact, life would be impossible without it. Let me explain. As powerful as the human brain may be, it is easily overwhelmed by the sheer onslaught of observation, calculation, sight, sound, and signals that envelop our every waking hour. The brain cannot permit itself to register and record each image and movement, every message and stimulation. Instead, our brains and nervous systems aggressively filter and limit our intake to manageable levels. The result? We notice a fraction and ignore the fullness, and remember far less. Often, we purposely engage in what cognitive neuroscientists call selective attention, like focusing on a dinner partner in a crowded restaurant, while tuning out all other conversations in the room. Now imagine that you had the ability to absorb everything around you, to absorb, comprehend, and recall all the details, and fetch every memory at will, without being overwhelmed. That is the incredible experience of the human soul, once it detaches from the body at the close of a lifetime. Unshackled from the frailties of a nervous system, unrestricted by networks of neurons, it is unbelievably free and powerfully present. It is free to absorb truths that mortal minds cannot contain, present to delight in the divine radiance that courses through the cosmos, to bask in divine understanding that supersedes human senses, but is savored by the newly liberated soul.
Our feelings are limited by our physical bodies. The physical heart is not capable of processing and experiencing all the emotions at their real essential level. What we experience is just a watered down version of all these soulful feelings. But once the ruach, the part of the soul that drives emotion and feeling, departs the body, it's completely revealed and meaning free to experience itself in a way deeper way than before. It's like watching an HD movie on an old flip phone. You're not experiencing it to its fullest. It's got so much more. It's got so much more there, but you're only seeing it on this small screen because that's the vessel that you're equipped with. And now, this is also that heightened level of self that others can tap into after a person's passing, because it kind of radiates downward in a real manifest way from above, which explains also why this whole idea explains on a mystical level that a person's moment of passing is an immensely holy and significant moment, because at that moment all their spiritual energy that has been kind of pent up and entrapped in the physical restraints of the body are now unleashed, no longer tethered to its material container. And it's now revealed to itself and all those who loved him or her. Now, yes, this letter from the Alter Rebbe that we mentioned before to introduce these ideas was referring to a tzaddik, a holy individual, but it also applies to each of us, because we all have a tzaddik within us. That tzaddik within us is our spiritual selves, which are busy with faith, reverence, and love, because we all possess a holy soul. All of our holy and beautiful ideas, feelings, and emotions and principles are all rooted in the part of the soul called the ruach, like we discussed. And when someone passes away, these feelings and principles, they don't vanish. They're actually intensified. And now they're also accessible to all those who love the person and seek to connect with that person through love. And the more we love, the more we connect. And when we connect, we're connecting not just to the ray of their essence and their feelings and emotions, but now we're connecting straight into their emotions and feelings, straight to the ruach, because it's no longer tethered to and held down by the nefesh. It's also been suggested, interestingly, that this is one of the reasons why we tend to, have a greater appreciation for people and their good qualities after their passing. Yes, of course, there's practical reasons for this phenomenon, but also there's a spiritual root to this that might be in the fact that a person's positive qualities are much more revealed and intensified at the moment of passing. Now, clearly, the moment of passing is not necessarily a moment that we're supposed to celebrate. However, this difficult moment of passing, yes, it's a difficult moment, but you should not feel like you've been disconnected from the loved one, because it's actually a moment that has the potential to intensify all of our relationships with our loved one, who now may be leaving this world physically. Now, as the Alter Rebbe explained in the letter, the way to be in touch with the deceased is through love. And we need to feel love for the deceased and tap into all these qualities in our own lives. To relate to someone, when a parent relates to a baby, they do it with a rattle, shaking a rattle, or they'll talk in a baby voice. And for a 5-year-old, you raise the level of your conversation. You'll read them a book or something else. At 11 or 12, you'll play a game of Monopoly with them. At 18, you relate in other ways. Our relationship with people constantly evolve based on the present needs of the one you're trying to relate to. So when a person passes away, many, if not most of the things that may have interested them before they passed away, not necessarily do they have that same meaning anymore. All the physical, so a lot of the physical things that they were interested in are less appealing to them now. And if we want to continue our relationship with them, we're challenged to meet them at their current state. And that's by becoming more spiritually attuned ourselves. And when we do so, we connect in a real meaningful way. Interestingly, psychologists have coined a phrase that relates to this, which is called continuing bonds, about continuing our relationship with our loved ones after they pass. And the best way to do it is to relate to them at their level, which is a spiritual level. So to summarize, while alive, a person's ruach, the part of their soul that drives feeling and emotion, is confined in and can only be expressed through the nefesh, the part of the soul that powers, bodily function and physicality. But at death, the ruach is no longer limited, and its essence is accessible to all those who wish to connect. When the physical avenues of connection are now shut off, the ability for spiritual connection and the possibility of spiritual connection is stronger than ever before. And even more so, once the ruach departs the body, on its own, it's free to experience itself in a much deeper way than ever before. We'll now go into our video meditation, which will help us visualize these ideas.
Welcome to our meditation reflection for Lesson 2 of Journey of the Soul. We're going to try to visualize and relate to the idea of the continuing connection between those who are still inhabiting this world and their loved ones who have moved on. How can we visualize this connection? So I want to share with you a metaphor that was given by the Lubavitcher Rebbe to a grieving family when they lost their dear mother. The Rebbe told the family, you should know that your loved one, when they pass away, hasn't gone to some faraway place. Really, what is the situation? It's as if the whole family is together on the first floor of the house, and this loved one is in the same house with you on the second floor. So we're going to try to visualize. Again, if it helps you to close your eyes, you can close your eyes. If you want to leave your eyes open, leave your eyes open. But start to visualize in your mind's eye. A loved one who's passed on. Try to imagine what it was like when you would gather and that person was physically with you. Try to remember the sights, the sounds, the whole setting. And now, imagine that exact same gathering, same setting, and that loved one who's passed on is still there, with one difference. They're on the second floor. Take a moment to imagine the feeling. It's hard to describe it, but if we envision it, we may be able to feel it. What does it feel like? The knowledge that this loved one, you may not be able to see them, but they're right there, very, very close by, in the same house, where the family is together, everyone is there, and the only difference is they're upstairs, they're on the second floor. Let's try to envision, let's try to visualize a loved one. Try to remember what it was like when they were on the first floor. And now think about the exact same setting. What does it feel like? What does it feel like knowing that they're on the second floor? They're with us. They're with us. They're in the same house. They're only just a few feet away. Not far, far, far away. Very close by on the second floor. Take a half a minute to visualize and try to connect to this feeling of the loved one on the second floor.
Now, understandably, a person's, final moments can be very difficult, not just for the people around them, but, for them as well. And here are some things that can help make it easier. This is based on a lot of Jewish thought and Jewish literature, as well as we find in modern psychology a lot of the same ideas. Number one is open communication and reminiscing about the good memories. It makes them, feel like they lived a good life. Physical contact is always good. Even quiet presence is good, just that they feel that you're there with them. Interestingly, there are actually studies now also that show that music not only is good for, the mood and, to help them relax, but it can actually even lessen pain. So that's always a good thing. Now, based on everything we've learned so far, you might expect that the soul would be very happy to separate from the body. It's finally free. It's finally unleashed. That it doesn't have to be tethered and tied down by physicality. And it can really, its essence can be in touch with all those around them. But as we see in the Zohar in text 2 on page 47, it's not so. It says in text 2, nothing is as hard for the soul as its separation from the body. Let me ask you a question. Why would it be so difficult? Why is it so painful for the soul? So, few answers. Number one is, death is the ultimate transition. Transitions are always difficult, no matter, even if it's a necessary transition, a positive transition. You bring your kid to school, even though they know they're going to have a good time, they still don't like that transition from, into school in the morning. And, we're creatures of habit. It's frightening. Every change is frightening. Even if it's a positive change, it's still scary. And a second answer is, like we learned last week, this world is where it can fulfill its mission. And this world is where it can do mitzvahs, it can effect positive change, do good deeds, change the world for better. Which is why, if you recall, we spoke about Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, Rabbi Judah the Nasi, who was crying on his deathbed because he knew that he would no longer be able to do mitzvahs once he gets to heaven. Thirdly, and maybe even most importantly, is that the soul, similar to the last answer, but the soul enters this world on a mission. To fulfill this mission, the soul and the body need to integrate, which means the soul is with the body as it experiences all its earthly pursuits. And just like the soul influences the body and the world and the body affect the soul as well. And to a degree, the souls become attached to their earthly, surroundings. And the process of divestment from this is very intense. And, it's almost like a couple that they may argue a lot, but at the end of the day, they're attached at the hip. The fusion of the body and the soul in this world is so seamless that the soul's departure can be painful. Not only for its loved ones, but for the soul, as well. It's the soul itself. And the soul also appreciated the body. And it is grateful to the body. And this separation is very difficult on the soul. As you see here, we see here, just to recap, number one is all transitions, even necessary and positive ones, are hard. And this is the ultimate transition. The next, number two, is the soul can only perform mitzvahs in this world. So it's mourning the loss of this opportunity. You can see on figure 2.2 and on student page 48. And number three is the soul and the body bond over time and develop an attachment. Breaking an attachment is very traumatic, and it's a powerful bond that is now broken. And now we'll see that the soul does not actually leave the body right away, as we will see in the following text. See in text 3 on page 49. This is from the Talmud. It says, for 3 days the soul hovers above the body, thinking that it can return to it. After 3 days, when it sees that the body's face has changed, it leaves the body and departs. So that's what the first 3 days, the first stage. Now, you would think that the soul would right away, run up to heaven to embrace, the celestial heights of spirituality. But the body was so precious to the soul, and the soul is forever grateful and attached to the body that he has trouble letting go. The soul has trouble letting go. And as long as the body is intact, the soul finds it difficult to abandon it. Now, during this whole interim period, while the body is decomposing, the soul is kind of displaced. It doesn't feel fully physical or fully spiritual. It doesn't feel comfortable in the fully physical world or the fully spiritual world. There's actually 4 general stages to the soul's departure. The first we just read above. That stage concludes after 3 days. And there are 3 more stages. The next stage is, we see in text 4a on page 50, that for 7 days the soul goes from the house where it lived to the grave, and from the grave back to the house, and it mourns its body. After 7 days, the body is subjected to its fate, and the soul ascends to its place. Interestingly, this is connected to the idea why we try, if possible, to sit Shiva in the deceased's home. We don't rent a ballroom or an Airbnb or do it somewhere else if we can, or in a friend's house. We try to do it in their own home because the soul comes back to its own home. The next stage, page 50, still on text 4b, it says in the Zohar that for 30 days the soul and the body are judged as one, and thus the soul is located down here on earth. After that, the soul ascends while the body erodes in the earth. The final stage, text 4c on 51, says for 12 months the body still exists and the soul ascends and descends. After 12 months, the body becomes null and the soul rises and no longer returns. So now we have 4 sources, each saying that the soul leaves at a different time. 3 days, 7 days, 30 days, 12 months. And there's also a text we discussed in the beginning of this lesson that says that the soul leaves the body, that the ruach is separated from the nefesh at the moment of death, but the nefesh still stays down here. So clearly it's a process. Interestingly, the soul also enters the body in a process. Conception, birth, the bris or baby naming, the bar bat mitzvah. So there's a process when the soul enters the body as well as a process when it leaves it. Now, it turns out that these 4 stages of departure correspond with the stage periods of how we mourning that are prescribed in Jewish law. We see this on page 52 in the Rambam in Maimonides, text 5. It says as follows. It says that mourners observe 3 days of weeping, 7 days of eulogies, and for 30 days restrictions on haircuts and wearing freshly ironed clothing, marrying, joining in a celebration of friends, and traveling on business. So according to Jewish tradition, this is not telling you that you have to cry for 3 days. It's just giving you a framework that is a healthy framework for a timeline for mourning. It says to cry for 3 days, and eulogize for 7 days, and then slowly lessen the level of mourning throughout the next full 12 months and onwards. You'll also see in text 6 on page 53 where it discusses how to talk to someone who has lost a close family member and how it changes based on how much time has elapsed. If it's within 30 days, offer words of consolation and avoid customary pleasantries. If 30 days have passed already, greet your acquaintance in the normal manner and offer indirect consolation. Avoid mentioning the deceased by name. Extend a generic consolation, such as may you be comforted. If your acquaintance is mourning the loss of a parent, you should offer direct messages of comfort for the first 12 months, and only after that, scale it back to indirect consolation. Next week, we will discuss the stages more in depth, the stages of mourning. Now, these phases of the mourning process reflect distinct stages. They reflect distinct stages in the departure of the soul from the body. Our degree of mourning mirrors exactly the degree of struggle that the soul is experiencing during that time in its process ascending to the realms which it originally came from. When we mourn, we're actually mourning not only for the deceased, but also with the deceased, and we accompany the soul on its journey and in a way participate in its grief. We share its pain and we empathize with it. The connection continues. Based on this notion, we can understand a somewhat curious halacha law in the context of a Talmudic episode. Just here on the screen, you see the 4 stages of mourning correspond to the 4 stages of departure. The degree corresponds. We mourn for the soul and with the soul. Now, text 7 on page 54, we see something interesting in the Talmud. It says, the idea is what it says, is that if a person passes away and there's no family, we still should send 10 people to sit Shiva in the person's house. And it says a man once died in Rabbi Yehuda's neighborhood and there were no mourners. Rabbi Yehuda sent 10 people every day to sit in the deceased home. After 7 days, the dead man appeared to Rabbi Yehuda in a dream and said, "May your mind be at rest, for you have set my mind at rest." So Shiva is obviously not just about the, you would expect Shiva is about the mourners, to console them, their grief and their pain. This episode in the Talmud tells us obviously something else. Shiva is also about the soul's pain. We share in the soul's pain, and thus it is important, regardless of whether there are mourners, to sit Shiva and be with the soul at that time also, as we share in its pain. And when people come to comfort the mourners, the soul of the deceased is comforted as well. So just to summarize, death is difficult for the soul because it's a transition, as well as the soul and the body integrate and bond, and this separation is painful. The soul, until the body fully decomposes, does not completely leave, as there are 4 stages to the soul's departure from the body that correspond with the 4 stages of mourning. And when we mourn, we're not mourning only for the deceased, but also with the deceased. The comforters come to comfort the mourners and the soul as well. Now we will move on to handling the body. We're on page 55 in the student book. The idea that the deceased remains very much spiritually alive and connected to those who loved and cherished him is illustrated and emphasized by the Jewish funeral traditions, one of which, and perhaps one of the most important parts in regards to attending a funeral, it's not just attending the ceremony or the eulogies, but actually to escort the dead, halvayas hames, which is the mitzvah is not to attend the ceremony, but to actually accompany and escort the deceased to burial. And the deceased senses our presence and our love and appreciates this. And the idea is not just to pay respect to the mourners, but to actually accompany the deceased on his final journey. And if you can't make it to the ceremony, it's very important to at least try and accompany follow the casket to the hearse, or follow the hearse a short distance, just to do that mitzvah of accompanying the deceased. We will now move on to care of the body. Interestingly, you'll see in text 8a a amazing comparison where it actually says that a human is compared to a Torah scroll in this regard. It says if a person is present at the time of someone else's passing, they have to tear their clothing, which is just like when someone sees a Torah scroll burning, they have to tear their clothing. Actually, now at the deathbed, it is no longer practiced, as the rabbis noticed that back in the day when people didn't have a lot of clothes, people started avoiding being at people's deathbeds and being with them as they passed because they didn't want to rip a pair of clothes. So the rabbi said it's more important to be with them in their final moments than to rip your clothes. So that actually is no longer practiced today, although we do rip our clothes later on by the funeral and Shiva. Now, what is this comparison between a human and a Torah scroll? What commonality do they share besides for just the fact that they're both holy? We'll start by citing the Ramban Nachmanides' understanding of why the human being is compared to a Torah scroll. We see this on text 8b on page 56. Nachmanides points to the sacred names of God that are inked on the Torah scroll's parchment as an analogy for the sacred soul that is installed within the corporeal body. So, a human being begins as flesh and bones. A Torah scroll begins as animal hide. It's parchment. Then the soul is infused to the human, right? Like we discussed in lesson 1, that a human started as just like a clay molding. And then the soul, God infused the soul, the same thing. God's name in the Torah is written on the scroll, and it becomes holy. The body becomes holy at that point. The same thing with the Torah scroll, it becomes holy at that point. Which is why we have to handle a body with great care, as you see in text 9, that you have to, you're handling a holy entity. It's more than just, the body is more than just a sheath to a sacred entity, to the soul. The body itself is now sanctified with independent holiness, similar to a Torah scroll. Which is why every sizable Jewish community has something called a Chevra Kadisha, which is a holy society of men and women that represent the whole community and take care of all the burials and the necessary preparations. Great pains are taken to, give the body dignity. It's treated delicately, never as a lifeless, feelingless object. There's no casual conversation allowed around the body. The body is always covered. It's never placed face down. And even more so, from the moment of death until the burial, the body's never left alone. It's always kept company by a shomer. It's called like an honor guard. Some funeral homes will include it in the services. In other cities, volunteers will do it, or friends. And as you see in text 10 on page 58, where it discusses that a body must be watched out of respect. For if we would leave the body alone, it would appear as if we had abandoned it like a utensil that we no longer require. So if we look on page 59 in the student book, figure 2.3, you see the pre-burial rites and rules. The body is handled with extreme respect and dignity. The deceased is covered at all times. The body is gently cleansed and dressed in shrouds. The body is never placed face down. Light-hearted conversation is avoided in the presence of the deceased, and a guard remains in proximity at all times out of respect for the deceased. And we see this on the screen as well, that the body is treated with great, great respect and dignity. Now, also, every part of the body, all the skin, the bone fragments or tissue, fluid, everything must be respectfully buried. And considering that the body is regarded as inherently holy, it is understood that the body in its entirety must be buried. Many of you may have seen images post-October 7th or terrorist attacks where they have a team called Zaka that actually comes and takes great care to pick everything up. Unfortunately, I believe they even had to bury a couple cars that they just couldn't separate everything from the car when they were like burned to whatever it was. But they take great care and pain to make sure that every part of the body is buried. Generally, is also most commonly the issue comes up with hospital sheets, with blood, or when they disconnect lines or pipes from the body, that no skin or tissue or fluids or any part of the body, however small, we want to make sure it's not lost. And text 11 will explain why every part of the body is so important. On page 60, we'll read it together. There is no differentiation in reverential treatment between a complete Torah scroll and a single letter that has become detached from a Torah scroll. Similarly, it is forbidden to handle with disrespect even a single bone that has become detached from a sacred body that was created in God's image. Even after its death, the body still has a special status of being a garb for the soul that contains residual holiness. So we have to treat it with utmost dignity in recognition of its important mission. So to summarize, the body is analogous to the parchment on a Torah scroll. The underlying principle that guides the care for a corpse is that dignity and sensitivity is paramount, and even after death, the body retains its special status of having been a garment for the soul. This will lead us to a very important, highly revered tradition, burial. The mitzvah, an obligation to bury the dead, is found in Devarim, in Deuteronomy. In text 12, we see it on page 61. It says, "You shall surely bury him on the same day as his death." King Solomon, in text 13, talks about burial in the following terms. Each to their native home. Text 13, it says, "People proceed to their eternal abodes, and the mourners go about the streets. The dust returns to the earth as it was, while the spirit returns to God who bestowed it. A human being is just a custodian of his body. Eventually the day arrives where you got to return the deposit. God takes the soul from man, but it is our job and our task to return the body. You can't literally hand over the body to God, but we can return it to the place from which God fashioned it. God created Adam, the first human being, from earth, so we return the body to the ground, to the place from which God fashioned the first human being. And as we see in text 14, on page 63, it says, "For you are dust, and you will return to dust. The body comes from the earth, and it is entrusted as a deposit to the individual's care. Upon death, the deposit must be returned to the earth from where it came and be buried there." The Torah recounts many episodes of burial. Amongst them, we see with Sarah and Abraham and Rachel and Isaac, with Yaakov and Yosef leaving Egypt. Moses. It says God Himself buried Moses. Amazingly, the Israeli army today is known to take great risks, even venturing behind enemy lines to bring bodies of fallen comrades back to Israel to give them a proper burial. So again, the body comes from the earth. It's entrusted as a deposit, and the deposit must be returned to where it came from. Unfortunately, today, this Jewish tradition of burial is threatened by the popularity of cremation. Cremation has been increasing dramatically in recent years. In 2015 was the first time that cremation exceeded burial. In the most recent statistic I have is 2018, where 53.1% of Americans chose cremation. Those numbers are steadily rising, and they project that it might be up to almost 80% in 2035. By comparison, in 1960, only 3.6% of Americans that died were cremated. Unfortunately, many people today believe that it is permissible. It happens to be cheaper. It's a financial thing as well. But understand, as far as finances, that I had someone tell me that it's a waste of money. Waste of money for someone who, is often subjective. Is it a waste of money to spend, $50,000 on a wedding, or $25,000 on a vacation, $200 on a restaurant when you can make food at home for $20? What determines if something is a waste of money or not is simple. If it is important, it's not a waste, but something essential. If burial is important, which is the argument we're making now, spending money on it is not just a luxury, but it's a necessity. And we will find that many communities and funeral homes will help make it happen if a person needs a little bit of help to make that happen. But generally, it's held in the highest regard to do a proper Jewish burial. Cremation destroys the body, makes it impossible to fulfill the biblical injunction to bury the dead. So we've established that burial is important, but why? So, like this. Burial serves as an affirmation of two fundamental Jewish beliefs. Number one, we believe our bodies aren't ours. They belong to God. When we bury a corpse, which is the instruction of the owner, we're affirming this belief. Number two is, one of the fundamental tenets of Judaism, the 13 principles of faith, one of them is the resurrection of the dead. We have the firm belief that there's a better time coming, the Mashiach, and we trust that we will be resurrected to witness that awaited day. And this belief has sustained our nation throughout everything and anything over 2,000 years. Belief in the resurrection of the dead is synonymous with the belief of the enduring value of the soul, of the enduring value of the body. One who believes in the resurrection and the holiness of the body would never destroy it. And burying a body intact is an affirmation of this belief. These two ideas are really connected because they both speak about the significance and the value of our bodies and our bodily pursuits and endeavors. Our bodies are important. They're holy because they belong to God. And He cares deeply about how we treat our bodies. And moreover, our bodies are so important that one day they will be resurrected. Cremation is an implied statement of rejection of God's ownership of our bodies, of the holiness of the body, and of the belief in our resurrection. It's an implicit and permanent declaration that once the soul has departed the body, the lifeless body has served its purpose and now has no further value. Which is why this is so important to the fact that most Jewish funeral homes, if not all of them, will never turn somebody away for lack of funds, because it's such an important thing. It's not just another prohibition, quote unquote. It's associated with some of Judaism's core beliefs. And it constitutes a permanent and irrevocable statement. Therefore, it's incredibly important, even for someone, who may say, I'm not such a good Jew, I'm not Orthodox. This is very, very important for all of us. Interestingly, I've heard many times about people opting for cremation because of ecological issues. They don't want their remains to waste, badly needed land, and it's green. Actually, the facts will show that cremation actually is much worse for the environment. It releases a great deal of carcinogenic materials into the atmosphere, and it also uses far more energy than in-ground burial. Interestingly, there's a growing trend today, actually, of green burial or natural burial, which is simple, natural, just in a simple biodegradable casket or shroud, a shroud, a favorite blanket, no embalming fluids or concrete vaults. As it turns out, Jews have been doing this for thousands of years. Green, environmentally friendly burial, simple pine box, straight in the ground, biodegradable, and we will continue to do so until the coming of Mashiach. Because we don't burn something that we think we're going to use again one day. We place it in storage. We bury it properly. It even says in the Mishnah that someone who explicitly, knowingly opts for cremation, out of spite, may not even be resurrected, and because we don't burn something we're going to use again. And understand also that we're not saying that those who have been cremated cannot be resurrected. Undoubtedly, those who were cremated was against their wishes, or due to ignorance. Of course, they'll be resurrected. Not too many years ago, we had 6 million of our best who were cremated against their will. But choosing cremation is tantamount to rejecting the concept of resurrection of the dead, one of the core concepts of Judaism. And it's therefore viewed quite harshly in Jewish tradition. Now, what if a person, due to ignorance or spite or whatever it is, specifically requests to be cremated? Is the family obliged or allowed to respect such wishes? As we see in text 15, a person's last will is very important. It says on page 64, text 15a, it's a mitzvah to implement the expressed final wishes of the deceased. So it's understandable. However, as we see, it's an exception to the rules when someone requests to not be properly buried. Page 15, text 15b on page 64, it says, we disregard the request because burial is a mitzvah and you shall surely bury him. As we said before, a person's body, there's a few reasons. Number one is because a person's body doesn't belong to him. So there's no justification for allowing the wishes of an individual who has to be cremated. If a person asks us while they're alive to wound them, you're not allowed to wound them just because they ask. And we wouldn't listen if a person says, in their will that you want them to burn their neighbor's house down. It doesn't belong to them. Also, on a deeper level, that person surely at this point, now that they're in the world of truth, surely wants to be buried properly. They've seen the truth. And they surely see the value of a proper Jewish burial at this point. So, as you see here on the screen, it's a mitzvah to implement the express wishes of the deceased. But if a person requests not to be buried, we disregard the request because we're granting what the deceased wants presently. And it's safe to assume that the deceased soul will bring much heavenly mercy and blessings upon those who help ensure that it gets a proper Jewish burial. So to summarize, burial is of the highest priority in Jewish tradition and culture. It affirms the two fundamental Jewish beliefs that our bodies belong to God and that we will be resurrected. Cremation makes it impossible to fulfill the mitzvah of burial. Choosing cremation is an implied rejection of these beliefs. And we try to bury a person even if he expressly requests to be cremated. And there are even some opinions that say, as a deterrent against cremation, voluntarily cremated ashes are not put in Jewish cemeteries, and we do not observe the Shiva. If they did it voluntarily, almost out of spite. We'll now finish off quickly with the grave visitation section. Now, the interment of the deceased is not the end of our connection, even to the physical remains. Visiting the grave expresses respect for the departed. It shows that their memory has not been forgotten. It reinforces our continuing and continuous connection with them. Now, like as we learned earlier, that according to Kabbalah, to Jewish mysticism, even as the soul ascends on high, a portion, the nefesh, still remains connected to the body in the grave. As we see something beautiful in the Zohar, that it says on page 66, text 16, that the nefesh remains in the grave due to the fact that it remains amongst the living. It is acquainted with their pain. At their time of need, it pleads with God for mercy on their behalf. When the inhabitants of the world are in need, when they are in sorrow and visit the cemetery, the nefesh is aroused to their plight. It ascends and awakens the ruach, part of the soul, which is up in heaven, which in turn entreats God for mercy. Consequently, the Holy One, blessed be He, has mercy on the world. Beautiful thing. Because the soul is one entity with various aspects, like we said, part of it is down here and part of it is in heaven with God, closer to God. The burial place is kind of like a communication port that allows us to communicate with the souls above and allows us to have them intercede before God on our behalf. And interestingly, the mystics also tell us that the dead are not only sensitive to the living who visit the cemeteries, but they're also pleased when they receive visitors, as we see the following story in text 17. It's a story in text 17, page 67, about a community that was relocating, and someone who was buried in that community appeared to a community member in a dream and asked them please not to leave because they want visitors, and if the community leaves, they won't have any visitors. And it says also in Samuel and the prophets about Barzillai the Gileadite, who said he wants to die in his own city, so people visit him. And when we pray on behalf of the deceased, they pray for us in turn. This bond and this connection is mutual. As we explained at the beginning of this lesson, our connection and bond continues even after one's passing. And it's a mutual connection. As well as something else interesting is that there are actually special days where it's especially appropriate to visit a gravesite. This includes on yahrzeits, the anniversary of the passing, as well as the day before Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So just to summarize, the nefesh, part of the soul, remains connected to the body in the grave, but because the soul is one entity, even the ruach and the higher levels of the soul are connected. So the nefesh connects with that part of the soul, with the higher levels, and the gravesite's thus like a communication port, right up to the highest levels of the soul, which are right next to God, and they can intercede on our behalf. And also, a beautiful thing is that the dead are pleased when they receive visitors. They love when they receive visitors. So to conclude, Much of today's lesson was devoted to the soul's departure from this world and the continuing relationship we have with it. In section 2, we explained the soul's disengagement from the body and how it allows us to have a deeper and more essential relationship with our loved ones. Section 3, we explained how we here in this world accompany the soul on its painful journey. We mourn with the soul and comfort it. In section 4, we discussed the special relationship we have with the deceased that includes the body too, hence the great care and respect we have for the corpse. In section 5, we continued on this theme and explained how our relationship with the deceased leads us to visit its earthly resting place from time to time. I'll finish off with an excerpt from a letter that the Rebbe wrote in 1958 to a young woman, Mrs. Hannah Sharfstein, who had, within a 5-year period, lost her father, mother, and mother-in-law. She was going through a very difficult time, obviously, and she wrote a very emotional letter to the Rebbe, the towering figure and leader. And he responded with the following letter. Read it quickly. Text 18 on page 68. Blessing and greeting. I received your undated letters in which you write about your emotional upsets in connection with the passing of your mother and the questions which are troubling you in this connection, involving also questions in regard to the passing of your father, peace be upon them. We'll skip a little bit into the letter where the Rebbe now begins something amazing. It says, another fundamental point to remember, which has a direct bearing on your letter, is that all believers in God believe also in the survival of the soul. Actually, this principle has even been discovered in this physical world, where science now holds as an absolute truth. There's nothing in the physical world that can be absolutely destroyed. How much more so in the spiritual world, especially in the case of the soul, which in no way can be affected by the death and disintegration of the physical body. It would be silly and illogical to assume that because a certain organ of the body ceases to function, affecting other physical organs in the body, the spiritual soul would also be affected thereby. The truth is that when the physical body ceases to function, the soul continues its existence, not only as before, but even on a higher level, inasmuch as it no longer is handicapped by the restraints of the physical frame. Thirdly, the attachment of children to their parents, and the general attachment between close relatives during life on this earth, is surely not a physical attachment by the respective physical bodies of the relatives. Essentially, the attachment is a spiritual one, due to the spiritual affinity between those concerned and the qualities of the soul, including such spiritual things as character, kindness, goodness, etc., all of which are attributes of the soul and not of the body. Therefore, also every action on the part of a person in relation to a beloved person and a desire to benefit that person is not directed towards the pleasing of his physical body, his bones and tissue, for it is the spiritual pleasure that one is concerned with. In view of the above, it is clear that even after the physical body has disintegrated and disappeared from view, it is still possible to bring joy and benefit to the soul, which, as noted above, not only survives, but does so on a higher level. And all the things which had previously brought joy and pleasure to one's parents will continue to do so even after they are physically no longer here. A few brief words that encompass very, very much. You can see on student page 70, there's a beautiful exercise, exercise 2.1, to record an insight from this lesson that resonated with you. And number 2 is there a deceased person with whom you wish to strengthen your bond of love, and what steps can you take to do so? So just to summarize the letter, this section, we recap the main points of the lesson. It contains a letter that discusses the continuing connection between the souls of the deceased and their loved ones here in this world. And we just concluded with our takeaway exercise. And next week we will discuss those left behind, the Jewish grieving process, the perspective on grief, the Shiva etiquette, and much more.
Lesson 2.
Here are
Taking
the
leave.
points of today's lesson.
1. Nefesh and Ruach are two of the soul's components. After death, the Nefesh remains with the body, while the Ruach disengages and ascends to Gan Eden, paradise. 2. Once the Ruach is no longer limited to material existence, it's more accessible to all who wish to connect to it. Thus, when a person dies, our ability to spiritually connect with him or her is stronger and deeper than before. 3. Though the Nefesh remains in the grave, it retains a connection with the higher levels of the soul. The gravesite is thus a portal where we can communicate with departed souls and ask them to intercede before God on our behalf. 4. Over the course of a lifetime, the soul and body integrate and bond. Their separation at death is therefore painful for the soul. 5. The soul departs the body in stages. These stages correspond to the prescribed periods of mourning. When we mourn, we are mourning not only for the deceased, but also with the deceased. 6. Dignity and sensitivity are the underlying principles that guide the care of a corpse and its preparation for burial. This is because even after death, the body retains its special status of having been the container for the soul. 7. Burial is of highest priority in Jewish tradition and culture. When God takes a person's soul, we are tasked to return the body to the place from which God fashioned it. 8. Burial affirms two fundamental Jewish beliefs. A. Our bodies aren't ours. They belong to God. And B. There will be a resurrection of the dead in the Messianic era.